actionfigureresource.com. Yesterday's toys, today's treasures.
Hot Toys, an action figure resource guide to buying your first. What is this guide about? Hot Toys are a Hong Kong-based manufacturer and production house that began in 2000, making high-end military action figures in the 1/6 scale. They transitioned to the movie Masterpiece series and have produced toys for Star Wars, Marvel, DC, Aliens, Predator, Back to the Future, Planet of the Apes, RoboCop, Terminator, 300, and Resident Evil, to name but a few, along with stunning 6th scale versions of celebrities like Bruce Lee, James Dean, and Michael Jackson. Basically, their roster covers pretty much every abiding sci-fi movie and comic book icon of the past 4 decades. Rather than being a complete collecting guide or a complete history, it is a detailed introduction to Hot Toys for those who have been wondering about picking one up for the first time. What do you need to know? What should you take into consideration? And of course, which one is for you? Now, we don't usually do guides of this nature because most action figures retail between $10 and $25. But newly released Hot Toys retail at between $220 and $275, and in the aftermarket they can fetch twice that and more. This is a serious investment that I was initially going to compare to buying a current generation games console, until I realized that the moment you get that console home and open the box, it will depreciate in value over the coming years, until in a decade you can pick one up for $30 at a flea market. Not so Hot Toys. They will either remain roughly at their market value or appreciate, making them more of an investment. They may not be the fiscal action figure collector's dream acquisition of an inexpensive end-of-the-line wave of figures that you buy for a song, store for a few years, and then sell at 10 times what you paid to someone who really wishes they'd been there to snag them when you did. But since most Hot Toys are limited run and don't get reproduced year after year, you almost always have something unique and desirable. They came into being at a time when the previously niche and geeky was becoming mainstream big business, and since the production house's main focus turned to rendering the characters in the biggest blockbusters into luxury models, Hot Toys surfed the wave of the adult collector looking for a serious step up from the comic book store figures of their youth. I've seen collectors on YouTube showing off their dozens of Hot Toys, and my legs have turned to jelly at the thought of that continuous financial hit that those collections represent. But if you have the right career, this is in fact an affordable prospect, with each of these costing about as much as an expensive night out. What can I expect from my figure? The likenesses are uncanny, in the truest sense. Almost always leaping over the plunge of the uncanny valley. That's where stylization approaches realism before taking on aspects that we find unsettling, almost human but not, and landing at the other side, usually hanging by its fingers Indiana Jones style. In other words, they look so realistic, so close to their source actor, that these are best described as foot-tall, posable waxworks for your own personal museum. Each Hot Toy, as standard, utilizes a base body, and it's when their clothes are off and you can see this structure that the familiarity with certain classic action figures hits home. In effect, these are Mego figures, just really, really good ones. At the feet, the boots attach via snap-on hinged ankle ball joints, and likewise at the wrists, hands, gloved or otherwise, are detachable and interchangeable with the usually several alternate sets. Many Hot Toys come with interchangeable heads. Care must be taken when removing these. Firstly, they must be tilted on one side to ease the ball peg out of the socket rather than exerting too much direct force on the softer sleeve holding it in place. Secondly, and more obviously, the face is the part of the figure where an overwhelming amount of the character identity is located, and you don't want to crush or misshape the features, especially since replacement or alternate heads could fetch around $50 on eBay if they can be found at all. Belts, pads, armor, and accessories are sometimes removable, sometimes attached to the pants or tops. Extreme care is suggested with handling these delicate constructions, and it's actually ill-advised to repeatedly undress and redress your Hot Toy. It wasn't designed to be G.I. Joe or Action Man. It's frequently possible to do so, but these are primarily for display rather than play. For these purposes, nearly all Hot Toys come with some kind of display stand. Typically they have adjustable wire holders with something called a crutch cradle to rest your figure on. Occasionally there will be more elaborate dioramas. The figures themselves have a surprisingly weighty heft, and you can feel the value when you handle them. They will hold their pose, and with the alternate hands and heads and other pack-in accessories, as well as those that you can track down elsewhere, you can frequently get a variety of different looks and stances from a single figure. Which Hot Toys figure should I choose? The obvious answer is the one you want the most. But the reality is that with so many available, so many more on the way or coming up for pre-order, quite a range of different prices on the aftermarket, and an availability of additional accessories at additional cost, and with so many licenses beloved by so many, you actually have to think very carefully on your first figure. A more pertinent question should be, should I buy a Hot Toy at all? Because in perspective, if you take your average $250 example and set it against other action figures, you could get 12 Hasbro Marvel Legends for that price. That's a lot of very good figures. You could get 2.5 premium Play Arts Kai figures, 7 mail-order figures plus shipping from Matty Collector, 62 blind-bagged Lego minifigures, and that's if you don't get a bulk deal on any of those. One Hot Toy represents a whole boatload of other toys that you could get instead. You could also feed a small family for 2 weeks to a month, depending on how much pasta you eat. But ultimately, everyone's budget is different, and you wouldn't be watching this unless you've already seriously entertained this notion. And if you're like me, that thought will stick with you, rattle around in your head for months or years even, until you start setting yourself up to take the plunge. The good news is that if you get buyer's remorse, you can get a lot of what you paid back by reselling the figure straight away. More so if you return it carefully to its packaging, put it back in the remailer, and store it somewhere very safe and dry for a few years. See our guide to storing your action figures for tips. You may suffer from buyer's remorse, as it is ultimately just another action figure, but wait a few days, see if it passes before acting. As far as which figure to choose goes, you should narrow it down to a top 5 favourites, then whittle that down to a top 3, then 2, and then if you haven't done so already, if you're like me, type out a colour-coded obsessive-compulsive chart of strengths and weaknesses of your top choices. If the figure is less of a financial investment and more for you to display, and you aren't sure you want or can afford any more than that one lone Hot Toy, ask yourself the following 3 questions. Which character resonates with me the most? If applicable, which film did I most enjoy them in? If multiple costume editions are available, which one is the version I see this character wearing when I close my eyes? That's a really good way of just nailing down the basics of that character. Again, these all seem simple, but for the first one, it is worth doing right. So why is a purchase like this worthy of such deep consideration? Allow me to draw on my own experience to illustrate this one. Back in the mid-2000s, I developed a serious lightsaber collecting habit. Before it began, the 1-to-1 scale Master Replicas model I first really wanted, that's Obi-Wan from Episode 2, was far more expensive by more than $100 than the newly released Obi-Wan from Episode 3, simply because it had been out a year or two and was unavailable in stores now. I bought the cheaper Obi-Wan, which I adored. I adored it so much that I then bought the Darth Maul with the money I had, in inverted commas, saved. After that, it was Han Solo's blaster because he was my favourite character, then Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber because even though I hated the character, I managed to win an eBay auction that I was expecting to lose, and the lightsaber was cool, and so on through Luke and Vader and Yoda and the Stormtrooper blaster until eventually Master Replicas released an Elite Edition Obi-Wan from the Phantom Menace, which was technically mostly identical to the Episode 2 saber. But being Elite, it cost around $100 more. Do you see what I did there? I had spent well over $1,000 not buying the one I wanted until I was finally able to do that. And of course I was then hit with financial troubles, and one by one the sabers all went, especially the Obi-Wan Elite because it was the most valuable. Today I only have the Han Solo blaster left because he's still my favourite character. I wish I'd kept that Luke Skywalker Graflex from A New Hope though. And since Master Replicas lost the license to Hasbro a few years later, and Hasbro has had no interest in premium replicas, these sabers are now double and triple and quintuple what I sold them for back in the day. In other words, the figure you really, truly want may be more expensive than a lot of the others, but it could well be false economy, especially if you have the collector's itch. I'm very familiar with that. To imagine that a cheaper compromise will satisfy long term. Again, your experience may vary, and if you can shrewdly find a workaround that fits you, that is the most important thing. Satisfaction can be gained from many aspects of collecting. The research, the hunt, the acquisition, the unboxing, the play, the day-to-day admiration of your display, the reselling for more than you paid, or even, for those who get there, the passing on of a treasured possession to someone you know will really appreciate it just as much as you. That's the other side of paying so much for a toy. You get to think seriously about what to do with it. These figures command a respect that few of their peers can achieve.
actionfigureresource.com. Yesterday's toys, today's treasures.